I still remember the exact moment my life stopped feeling like mine anymore. I had just lost my job in a sudden corporate layoff, standing in my kitchen with the termination email still open on my phone, when my husband looked at me like I had already failed him. He didn't yell at first. He just sighed and called me a burden like it was the most natural truth in the world. But what he didn't know was that I had already accepted a better offer before I even walked through our front door that night. And by the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. If this story speaks to your heart, please take a second to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from right now, your city, your country, and even what time it is in your part of the world. I truly read those moments, and it means more than you know. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night everything in my marriage quietly started to fall apart, even though I didn't say a single word at first. But before I tell you how it ended, I need to take you back to where it all began, because nothing about that night made sense unless you understood what led up to it. I came home earlier than usual that evening, still holding my laptop bag in one hand and my phone in the other, my job officially gone after a restructuring notice that felt colder than I expected. The air inside our apartment in Chicago felt different the moment I stepped in, like it already knew something had shifted. Jason, my husband, was sitting on the couch with the TV on low volume, his eyes briefly moving toward me as I placed my keys on the counter a little too carefully, like I was trying not to disturb something fragile. I remember opening my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. There was a strange silence between us, the kind that doesn't feel empty but heavy, like it's waiting for something to break it. He finally asked me if I was okay, but not in the way someone asks because they care, more like someone asking because they already assumed the answer. I told him I lost my job, trying to keep my voice steady, expecting comfort, or at least surprise. Instead, he leaned back slightly, exhaled through his nose, and said nothing for a few seconds that felt longer than they should have. Then he looked at me and said I needed to be realistic, that things were going to change now, that I couldn't just keep coasting. I still remember how his words landed, not loud, not angry, just final. And then came the sentence that I didn't expect to hear from him, not like that, not in that tone, when he said I was becoming a burden. I didn't react the way he expected me to. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't even ask him to take it back. I just nodded slightly, like I was agreeing with something small and unimportant, and that was the first moment he misunderstood everything about me. Because what Jason didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see in that quiet second, was that earlier that same day, before I ever stepped into our apartment, I had already received a second offer, one that changed everything I thought my future looked like. I had been recruited quietly, almost unexpectedly, by a consulting firm that Jason had never heard me talk about before, a company that saw value in me when my own life had just told me I was replaceable. I hadn't told him yet. I wanted to wait. I wanted to see what kind of person he would be when he thought I had nothing left. So I smiled that night, just slightly, not out of happiness, but out of understanding something he didn't. I watched him go back to his phone like nothing had changed, while inside me something already had. The room felt normal again, but only on the surface. Underneath it, every sound, every pause, every breath felt like it belonged to a different version of my life that was already ending without him noticing. And that was when I realized something simple but irreversible, that sometimes the moment someone calls you a burden is not the moment you break, it's the moment you quietly start leaving. What happened next in the hours that followed would change the way Jason looked at me forever, but at that moment, he was still comfortable in his misunderstanding, and I was still sitting right beside him, already halfway gone, in a way he would never see coming. And if you want to understand how a single quiet night turned into a complete reversal of everything he believed about me, you'll need to stay with me as I take you back to the exact decision that started it all, the decision I made in silence long before he ever spoke. The silence in the room that night did not end when Jason turned back to his phone. It stayed there, stretching between us like something neither of us knew how to break. I remember sitting still on the edge of the couch, my hands resting loosely in my lap, watching the blue light from the television move across his face as if nothing important had just happened. But inside me, something had already shifted in a way I could not undo. The words he used, the way he said them without hesitation, were not echoing loudly in my mind. They were simply settling in, like dust after a door has been closed too hard. I did not ask him to repeat himself. I did not ask him to explain. I just listened to the quiet after it, and that quiet told me more than his voice ever could. A few hours earlier, before I walked into that apartment, I had been sitting in a glass conference room downtown, 22 floors above the streets of Chicago, listening to a woman in a navy blazer explain a role I did not expect to be offered so quickly. Her tone was calm, professional, precise. She spoke about strategy consulting, client leadership, and restructuring teams across multiple industries. But what I remember most was not the job description. It was the way she looked at me when she said they had been watching my work for months, even before the layoffs at my previous company. It felt strange to hear that, like someone had been observing a version of my life I had not fully understood myself. When she slid the folder across the table, she did not ask me to decide immediately. She simply said, "Take the night." But I already knew, sitting there with my phone vibrating once in my pocket, that I was going to accept it. I signed my name anyway, my hand steady in a way I did not feel emotionally. And when I left that building, stepping into the cold air of the city, I did not call Jason. I did not tell anyone. I just walked for a few blocks, letting the noise of traffic and footsteps settle around me, like proof that life continued even when everything inside you was quietly rearranging itself. That was the version of me that came home later that evening. Not broken, not desperate, but already carrying something new that no one else could see yet. Jason, of course, saw only what he wanted to see. A woman coming back from a termination email, a woman he believed had just lost her place in the world. He did not ask about the meeting I had in the morning. He did not ask why I had been gone longer than expected. He only saw the surface, and then he filled in the rest himself. I watched him from the kitchen as I poured a glass of water, noticing how casually he spoke when he said I needed to adjust my expectations, how easily he framed my situation as if it defined my entire worth. There was no anger in him, not really. That was what made it worse. It was not cruelty in the loud sense. It was certainty. The certainty that he was right. I remember placing the glass down carefully, the sound of it touching the counter softer than it should have been, and I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could sit so comfortably beside you and still not see you at all. Later that night, after he fell into his usual routine of scrolling through his phone and half-watching television, I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the closed door of our bedroom. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel emotional. I only felt clear in a way I had not felt in a long time. I opened my email again quietly, checking the confirmation one more time, as if I needed to remind myself that it was real. The offer was still there. The start date, the salary, the relocation options, all of it unchanged. And in that small moment, standing in the dim hallway light, I understood something simple but final. My life had already started moving in a different direction, and Jason was still speaking to a version of me that no longer existed. I closed the phone slowly, without making a sound, and walked back into the living room, sitting beside him as if nothing had changed at all. But something had. And even though he leaned back comfortably, completely unaware, I knew that the next time he looked at me, he would not understand what was already in motion. The next morning arrived without any dramatic change, yet everything inside me felt different in a way I could not explain to Jason. He was already awake when I walked into the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand, scrolling through his phone like it was just another ordinary day. When he glanced at me, there was nothing unusual in his expression, no trace of last night, no awareness that something had already shifted permanently between us. He simply asked if I wanted coffee, as if the word burden had never been spoken in our home. I nodded once, taking a glass from the cabinet instead, watching how normal everything still looked on the surface. The sunlight coming through the window hit the counter at a soft angle, the same way it always did in the mornings, and for a moment I wondered how many versions of a life can exist in the same room at the same time without anyone noticing. Jason left for work about an hour later, kissing my cheek quickly without looking at me too closely, already mentally somewhere else. I stood by the sink after he left, holding the edge of the counter, not because I was upset, but because I was observing something I had never noticed before. The way silence can feel different when you are no longer inside it emotionally. That morning, I received another email from the consulting firm confirming my onboarding schedule. including a relocation discussion later in the week. I read it once, then again, not because I doubted it, but because I was adjusting to the reality that my future no longer belonged to the environment I was currently standing in. Jason did not ask about my day when he texted me later that afternoon. He sent a simple message about dinner plans, something casual, something routine. I replied the same way I always had, short and calm, keeping my tone unchanged. But inside, I was no longer negotiating my place in that rhythm. I remember walking through the apartment later that day, noticing small details I had ignored for years, like how many things in our home were organized around Jason's preferences without me ever questioning it. The furniture arrangement, the shared calendar, even the way certain conversations always circled back to his priorities. It was not resentment I felt, it was recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, does not need to be loud to be permanent. That evening, Jason came home slightly earlier than usual, dropping his keys on the counter with a tired sound before collapsing onto the couch. He asked me how my day had been in a tone that suggested he was not expecting anything significant in return. I told him it was fine. Not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left to explain in the way he thought there was. He began talking about his own work, about meetings, about pressure, about expectations, and I listened the way I always had. Except now I was hearing it differently. Not as a shared life, but as a separate narrative that I had somehow been standing inside without realizing I had the option to leave it. At one point, he looked at me and said, I should probably start applying to smaller roles for now. Something easier, something stable, something realistic given what had happened. His words were not harsh. They were practical in the way he believed was helpful. And that was the exact moment I understood how deeply misaligned our perspectives had become. I did not argue. I did not correct him. I simply nodded slightly, letting him continue speaking while I observed him the way you observe something you are about to step away from without touching it. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I stood near the window for a long time, looking at the quiet streets outside. The city lights reflected faintly on the glass, layered over my own reflection, and I realized I was already living in two timelines at once. One where I stayed and tried to shrink myself into something manageable for someone else's comfort, and another where I stepped into something entirely unknown but fully mine. I checked my phone one last time before bed, reading the onboarding confirmation again, this time letting it settle completely. There was no hesitation left in me, only timing. And timing, I was beginning to understand, was the only thing that separated staying from leaving. Jason turned slightly in his sleep as I lay down beside him, completely unaware that by morning, the distance between us would no longer just be emotional. It would be structural, and I had already decided which direction I was moving in. The next morning did not begin with any argument or dramatic moment, but with something far more unsettling for me: normality. Jason woke up before I did, as he always did during weekdays, and I could hear the faint sound of his footsteps in the kitchen, the soft clinking of a mug against the counter, the familiar rhythm of a life that no longer felt aligned with mine in the same way. When I walked in, he barely looked up from his phone, only muttering a good morning without emphasis, as if the night before had left no residue at all. I studied him for a second, longer than usual, noticing how easily he moved through routines that once defined both of us. Coffee, emails, notifications, work messages, everything structured, everything predictable. I realized in that moment that Jason was not blind to life. He was just committed to the version of it he already understood. And I was no longer inside that version. I poured myself water instead of coffee, leaning slightly against the counter, watching him scroll without urgency. There was something almost mechanical in how he processed the world in the mornings, as if everything important had already been categorized and nothing new could disrupt it. He asked if I had any plans for the day, not because he was curious, but because it was a question that belonged in routine conversation. I told him I would be out for a while, keeping my voice steady, neutral. He nodded without asking further. That small absence of curiosity used to feel normal to me. Now it felt like distance I could finally see clearly. After he left for work, I stayed in the apartment longer than usual, not because I was delaying anything, but because I was observing the space differently. Every object seemed to carry a history of decisions I had made, while prioritizing someone else's comfort over my own awareness. Even the way the furniture was arranged reflected compromises I had stopped noticing years ago. I walked slowly through each room, not emotionally overwhelmed, but quietly analytical, like I was reviewing a life I had once participated in but no longer fully inhabited. My phone vibrated twice during the late morning. It was the consulting firm confirming a final administrative step before onboarding officially began. They asked for documentation, availability, and relocation confirmation. I replied to each request carefully, not hesitating, not overthinking. There was a strange clarity in handling decisions that no longer required emotional negotiation with anyone else. Around midday, I stepped outside for the first time that day, walking through the streets of Chicago with no particular destination. The air was colder than expected, sharp enough to keep me fully present. People passed by quickly, each absorbed in their own direction, and I found myself noticing how separate everyone actually is, even when sharing the same space. I stopped briefly near a cafe window, watching reflections overlap with movement inside, and I thought about how easily lives can appear connected from the outside while being completely misaligned underneath. When Jason texted me later asking what I wanted for dinner, I paused before replying. Not because I was uncertain, but because the question no longer felt like it belonged to the same structure I was currently moving through. I responded with something simple, allowing the conversation to continue without friction. But internally, I was already beginning to detach from the expectation that these small exchanges defined anything meaningful anymore. That evening, Jason returned home slightly later than usual, his energy tired but familiar. He spoke about his day in fragments, mentioning meetings, deadlines, and pressure points at work. I listened as I always had, but something had changed in how I processed his words. It no longer felt like shared burden. It felt like observation. He asked me again about job applications, suggesting smaller roles, more stable environments, something that would allow us to reset. His tone was not cruel. It was structured around what he believed stability looked like. I remember nodding once, not in an agreement, but in acknowledgement that he no longer understood where I was mentally. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I sat quietly in the living room with the lights dimmed, reviewing the onboarding schedule one final time. Everything was already set. Start date, relocation steps, reporting structure. There was no ambiguity left. I realized then that leaving does not always begin with confrontation. Sometimes it begins with silence that becomes too clear to ignore. I looked toward the bedroom where Jason slept, unaware that the life he assumed was simply under temporary stress had already moved beyond his control to interpret. And in that quiet moment, I understood something that felt final without needing to be spoken aloud. The decision was no longer coming. It had already happened. And all that remained was the execution of a choice he still believed I had not made. The morning of what should have been an ordinary day felt different in a way I could no longer pretend not to notice. Jason left early again, his routine unchanged, his movements precise and unbothered, as if nothing in our shared space had shifted at all in the past several days. I stood by the window after he left, watching his car disappear into the steady flow of traffic, and for the first time I did not feel like I was waiting for anything from that direction. The silence in the apartment was no longer heavy or uncomfortable. It felt structured, almost final, like a page that had already been turned but not yet acknowledged. I checked my phone and saw the onboarding confirmation again, this time with a finalized schedule attached, including relocation instructions and a start date set for early next week. Everything was now concrete, no longer theoretical. I read through each line slowly, not because I needed clarification, but because I was allowing myself to fully accept that this was not an idea anymore, it was motion already in progress. I placed the phone face down on the counter and began moving through the apartment with a quiet intention I had not felt before. Not urgency, not panic, but clarity. I opened drawers and closets, not rushing, simply observing what belonged to me and what had accumulated over years of shared living. There was no emotional storm inside me, only recognition that I had been living in a space that no longer matched the direction I was heading. Around midday, Jason sent a message asking if I could handle picking up groceries later, mentioning a few items as if the structure of our household still depended on my availability in the same way it always had. I read it once, then set the phone aside without replying immediately. When I finally answered, it was brief and neutral, confirming I would take care of it. There was no resistance in me anymore, only distance. That afternoon, I went to the store, walking through aisles filled with ordinary movement, people selecting items, comparing labels, continuing lives that looked simple from the outside. I found myself thinking how easily everything appears stable when you are not the one preparing to leave it behind. I bought only what was necessary, nothing extra, nothing symbolic. At the checkout line, I stood behind a couple arguing softly about dinner plans, their voices blending into the background noise of the store, and I realized how many endings happen quietly long before anyone names them. When I returned home, Jason was not there yet. I placed the groceries down and stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than usual, looking at the familiar surfaces that had once represented routine comfort. Now they felt like checkpoints I was passing through rather than places I belonged to. I began packing slowly, not dramatically, not emotionally, but methodically, choosing only what I needed for what came next. Clothes, documents, a few personal items that actually mattered. Everything else stayed where it was. There was no anger guiding my movements, no resentment driving the decision. It was something far more irreversible than that. It was understanding. Jason returned later than expected that evening, his mood tired but normal, carrying the usual weight of his workday without any awareness of what had already begun to shift in his absence. He noticed the partially packed bag near the hallway and paused for only a second before asking what I was doing. His tone was not alarmed. It was curious, as if the answer could still exist inside the version of reality he understood. I told him I was getting things organized, my voice steady, measured. He accepted that answer without digging deeper, nodding slightly before moving toward the kitchen to set down his keys. That moment confirmed something I had already begun to accept. He was still speaking to a version of me that no longer existed in the same way. Later that night, we sat in the living room as we had so many times before, but the atmosphere between us had changed in ways that could not be reversed by familiarity. He talked about work, about plans, about the coming week, while I listened with a calm detachment that no longer required effort to maintain. At one point, he mentioned again that I should consider something simpler for now, something stable, something that would help us regain balance. The word us landed differently than it used to. I looked at him for a moment without responding immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I was recognizing how far apart our definitions had quietly become. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the hallway for a long time, the apartment dim and still around me. My bag was packed by the door. My phone was already set to silent. I checked the onboarding message one final time, confirming the next step, and then I placed the phone down gently. There was no emotional climax, no internal collapse, only a steady sense of completion. I understood then that leaving is not always an event marked by noise or confrontation. Sometimes it is a sequence of quiet decisions that reach their final point without announcement. I looked toward the bedroom where Jason slept, unaware that the structure of what he believed was still intact had already moved beyond his influence. And in that silence, I realized I was no longer preparing to leave. I was already in the process of being gone. The night before I left did not feel like a dramatic ending. It felt like the final stage of something that had already completed itself quietly over time. I woke up before Jason that morning, the apartment still dim, the air unusually still in a way that made every small sound feel sharper. For a moment but now it felt distant, like something happening in another version of my life that I was no longer required to participate in. I turned my head slightly and saw him still asleep, his expression relaxed, unchanged, unaware that the structure of everything he believed was still intact had already shifted beyond repair. I did not feel anger toward him. I did not feel sadness either. What I felt was a kind of final clarity, the kind that does not ask permission to exist. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and walked into the living room where my packed bag was already waiting by the door. Everything I needed for the next chapter of my life was inside it, and everything I was leaving behind was still asleep and unaware. I stood there for a few seconds, not hesitating, not debating, just observing the stillness of a place that had once defined me but no longer contained me. The onboarding message on my phone confirmed everything one last time. My start time, my relocation details, and my first official meeting were all scheduled for the following morning. There was no uncertainty left, only execution. I placed the phone back into my pocket, took a slow breath, and looked once more toward the bedroom before stepping forward. I did not wake Jason. I did not leave a note that explained everything in detail. I knew that any explanation I could give would still be interpreted through the version of me he had already decided to believe in. And that version was no longer real. I opened the door slowly, the lock clicking softly, and the sound seemed louder than expected in the quiet hallway outside. I stepped out into the early morning air of Chicago, which was colder than I remembered, sharp enough to make me fully aware of every step I was taking. The building entrance closed behind me with a soft, final sound, and I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, holding my bag, looking at the city as it began to move again around me. Cars passed, people walked quickly toward their own routines, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I was moving inside someone else's structure. I took a few steps forward, then stopped briefly. Not because I was unsure, but because I was noticing how strange it felt for a decision to be this quiet and still be this irreversible. Inside the apartment, Jason began to wake not long after I left. At first, nothing felt different to him. The bed beside him was empty, but that was not unusual in a household where mornings often began at different times. He got up slowly, walking into the living room expecting the usual signs of routine, the sound of movement in the kitchen, the presence of small morning habits that had always defined our shared space. But the apartment was too still, the kind of stillness that does not belong to normal mornings. He noticed my bag was gone first, then the absence of my phone on the counter, then the silence that did not feel temporary anymore. He called my name once, not loudly, but with growing confusion. There was no answer. He walked through each room more carefully this time, checking places without fully understanding what he was looking for. The closet confirmed what his mind had not fully accepted yet. My things were missing, not scattered, not half left behind, but intentionally gone. Only then did the realization begin to form in a way he could not ignore. He tried calling me, once, then again, but the phone rang without response. Outside, I was already several blocks away, moving through streets that felt unfamiliar only because I was finally seeing them without the weight of returning to something that no longer defined me. I stopped briefly near a crosswalk, watching the city move around me with its usual indifference, and I realized something simple. Leaving does not always feel like freedom in the moment it happens. Sometimes it feels like silence that is still adjusting to its own meaning. My phone vibrated once with Jason's call, but I did not answer. Not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left in that direction that required my participation anymore. When I finally reached the car that was waiting to take me to the airport, I placed my bag in the back seat and sat down without looking back at the building behind me. The driver asked if I was headed to O'Hare, and I said yes in a calm voice that no longer carried hesitation. As the car pulled away, I watched the streets slowly shift into motion, buildings passing one after another, each one marking distance instead of memory. Jason would understand eventually. Not immediately, not in the way he expected, but in the way reality reveals itself when denial is no longer enough to sustain it. And in that quiet movement forward, I understood something that no argument could have ever taught him. The moment he called me a burden was not the beginning of my collapse. It was the moment I finally stopped belonging to the life he thought I could never leave. The airport was louder than I expected, not because of noise itself, but because of how many small human moments existed at the same time in one place. Suitcases rolling across the floor, announcements echoing through the terminal, people saying goodbye without fully looking at each other. I stood in line with my boarding pass in hand, feeling strangely detached from the version of myself that had left Chicago only hours earlier. It was not sadness that followed me, and it was not excitement either. It was something quieter, like distance finally becoming physical. I checked my phone once while waiting, seeing one missed call from Jason and 2 messages that I did not open. I already knew what they would say, or at least what they would try to become in his mind. Confusion, then concern, then delayed realization. I turned the phone face down again without responding. The line moved slowly, and I watched strangers pass by in both directions, some arriving, some leaving, most unaware of anything beyond their immediate destination. When I finally boarded the plane, I found my seat by the window and placed my bag under the seat in front of me. The moment I sat down, I felt something settle inside me that I had not realized was still unsettled. Not peace exactly, but completion. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, and as the city of Chicago appeared through the window one last time, I did not feel the need to hold on to anything visible. I did not search for familiar streets or buildings. I simply watched it recede, becoming smaller without resistance. Jason, at that same time, was still moving through the apartment in a way that did not yet accept finality. He had called my phone repeatedly now, each attempt met with the same unanswered silence. At first, he assumed I was ignoring him in frustration, that this was some temporary reaction to stress or misunderstanding. He checked the kitchen again, then the living room, then the hallway where my bag had been. Each empty space added weight to something he was not yet willing to define. He sat on the couch eventually, holding his phone in his hand without pressing anything, staring at the screen as if the next action might change what was already happening. It did not. He looked at the coffee mug I had used earlier that morning, still sitting near the sink, untouched since I left, and for the first time a different thought entered his mind. Not anger, not dismissal, but uncertainty. He called again, this time slower, listening more carefully to the sound of ringing that led nowhere. I, meanwhile, was already above the city, the plane lifting through layers of cloud and light turbulence. I watched the ground disappear gradually, no longer feeling connected to the distance forming between what I had left and where I was going. A flight attendant passed by offering water, speaking politely in the neutral rhythm of travel, and I realized how easily life continues around major internal changes that no one else can see. Somewhere below, Jason finally opened my email on his laptop, something he had never needed to do before. The subject line was simple, formal, confirming my acceptance and start date. He read it once without reacting fully, then again more slowly, as if repetition could change interpretation. The words did not shift. The facts remained the same. I had not simply left the apartment. I had transitioned into something already structured, already active, already irreversible in professional terms. He leaned back slightly in his chair, still not fully processing the timeline, trying to connect the last conversation we had with the reality now in front of him. That gap, the one between assumption and fact, was where understanding began to form, but only partially. The plane continued forward, steady and unchanging, and I rested my head lightly against the seat, looking out at the clouds stretching endlessly in every direction. I thought briefly about Jason, not with resentment, but with clarity. He had spoken to a version of me that existed only in his interpretation, a version that no longer needed to respond in order to be real. And in that silence between what he believed and what had already happened, the distance between us finally became complete. The city was gone now, fully replaced by sky, and I understood that leaving was not a moment that needed validation from anyone who stayed behind. It was a process already finished the moment I stopped explaining myself to someone who had already decided not to understand. The descent began without warning, the way all endings and beginnings often do when you are no longer watching for them closely. I felt the slight shift in pressure inside the cabin first, the subtle change in engine sound, and only then did I realize we were beginning to lower through the clouds. Outside the window, the sky had turned into layers of soft gray and white, thick and endless, as if the plane was moving through something less like air and more like memory. I adjusted my seat slightly, watching the world below slowly start to return in fragments, shapes forming out of distance. I did not feel nervous. I did not feel uncertain. I felt something closer to arrival, not just in location, but in identity. Somewhere far below, Jason was still in the apartment, still trying to reconcile silence with logic. After reading the email once, then again he had opened our shared account details, not because he expected to find answers there, but because he was searching for continuity. Everything still appeared normal on paper: bills, subscriptions, shared utilities. Nothing reflected departure. That gap between digital normality and physical absence made it harder for him to accept what was happening. He called my phone again, this time leaving a voicemail without realizing he had started speaking faster than usual. His voice, when I would hear it later, would not sound angry. It would sound increasingly unstable in its certainty, as if repetition could restore structure. He said my name once at the beginning, then paused, then tried again, as though waiting for interruption that never came. In the plane, I watched the city I had left become visible again in the distance, small and distant through breaks in the cloud cover. Chicago looked almost peaceful from above, like a collection of systems functioning independently of the lives inside them. I thought briefly about Jason sitting in our apartment, still moving through rooms that now belonged more to memory than to presence. He would eventually understand the email was not a mistake. The consulting firm had already followed up with a second message, confirming relocation logistics and requesting final acknowledgement of my start date. The language was formal, precise, indifferent to emotional disruption. That was what made it irreversible in his mind. Not emotion, but structure. The plane wheels touched down with a soft but decisive impact, and the world outside shifted into motion again. As I stepped off the aircraft, the air in the new city felt different, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it carried no emotional residue. Everything here existed before I arrived and would continue after I left, and that realization felt grounding rather than isolating. I moved through the terminal with my bag, following signs that required no interpretation. My phone lit up briefly again, Jason's name appearing once more, but I did not open it. Not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing new left in what he was trying to send. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Jason was no longer sitting still. He had moved through the apartment again, this time more deliberately, opening drawers, checking counters, replaying small moments in his mind that now felt different in hindsight. The realization was no longer theoretical, it was physical. My absence was not temporary. It had structure, timing, and direction. He finally opened the onboarding confirmation email again, this time reading every line more carefully, slower, as if details could reveal hesitation. There was none. Start date, position, relocation confirmation, company name. Everything aligned too cleanly to be accidental. That was when the shift in him began, not as panic, but as recalibration. He started connecting earlier moments he had dismissed, my silence that felt different, my calm responses that no longer matched his expectations, my absence of reaction when he assumed there should be resistance. Each memory now rearranged itself into something he had misread rather than something he had understood. In the new city, I met the driver waiting outside the terminal, holding a simple sign with my last name. The ride to the temporary residence was quiet, the streets unfamiliar but not intimidating. I noticed how quickly my mind adapted when it was no longer tied to negotiation with someone else's perception. The building where I would stay during onboarding was modern, neutral, designed for transition rather than permanence. The concierge handed me my key card without conversation beyond verification. Inside the room, everything was clean, minimal, and intentional. I placed my bag down and stood for a moment in the center of the space, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was acknowledging arrival. Jason, hours behind me, had reached a point where silence could no longer be interpreted as disagreement. It had become confirmation. He tried calling again, this time leaving no message, just listening to the ring until it ended. The absence of response was now the only response he consistently received. I finally turned my phone back on fully after settling in. Notifications appeared in clusters, missed calls, messages, email alerts. I did not rush to open any of them. I understood them already without reading further. They belonged to a version of time I had already stepped out of. Later that evening, I stood by the window of the temporary room, looking at a different skyline, one that did not carry personal history. Lights turned on gradually across buildings, not for me, not against me, simply because evening was arriving. Jason, in contrast, was now fully inside the stage of realization where interpretation begins to collapse. Nothing new was needed to understand what had already happened. The structure of my departure was complete, not sudden, not chaotic, but precise in a way that left no space for reversal. And in that final alignment between absence and understanding, both of us were finally experiencing the same truth from opposite sides of distance. The night settled over the city I had arrived in, but it did not feel like night in the emotional sense I had known before. It felt more like a transition space, a pause between what had already ended and what had not yet fully begun. I stood by the window of the temporary apartment, watching the lights below form quiet patterns of movement across unfamiliar streets. There was no sense of urgency in me anymore, no tension pulling me backward, only a steady awareness that I was no longer waiting for anything to change in order for my life to move forward. My phone had been silent for nearly an hour, resting on the small table near the entrance. I had turned off most notifications earlier, not out of avoidance, but because I no longer needed constant confirmation of what I already understood. Jason was still calling, still sending messages, but each attempt now existed in a space I no longer emotionally occupied. I could feel the distance between us, not as something growing, but as something already complete. Back in Chicago, Jason was no longer moving through confusion alone. He had entered a stage where silence stops feeling like mystery and starts feeling like consequence. He sat at the edge of the couch for a long time, his phone still in his hand, replaying the last known structure of our shared life in his mind. Morning routines, casual conversations, small exchanges that now felt reinterpreted under a different meaning. The apartment no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a place that had lost its center without warning. He opened his laptop again, searching for the onboarding email I had received, scanning it line by line as if repetition could reveal something he missed. But everything remained consistent. My acceptance, my position, my relocation. There were no contradictions left to find. That was what made it difficult for him. Not chaos, but clarity. In the new city, I had spent the afternoon going through orientation documents at the temporary residence. Everything was structured, deliberate, and efficient. The kind of environment where decisions were already made in advance and execution followed without hesitation. I signed what needed to be signed, reviewed what needed to be reviewed, and responded to messages that required only confirmation. There was no emotional negotiation in any of it, just progression. At one point, I paused. It felt more like I had finally stopped adjusting myself to a space that was never designed for me to remain in permanently. Jason, meanwhile, had begun reaching out to mutual contacts without fully realizing what he was hoping to confirm. Each response he received only reinforced the same structure. I had left the apartment, I had accepted a position, and I had done so without conflict or confrontation. That lack of drama made it harder for him to place the moment in his previous understanding of me. He kept trying to locate emotional rupture where there was only transition. That evening, I attended a brief welcome session with a small group of new hires. The room was neutral, professional, and calm. Introductions were simple. Names, roles, expectations. I spoke when necessary, listened when appropriate, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to explain myself beyond what was required. After the session, I walked back alone through the quiet streets near the temporary residence. The air was cooler than earlier in the day, and the city felt structured in a way that did not demand emotional interpretation. Jason, on the other hand, had stopped calling repeatedly. Instead, he began rereading older messages, searching for patterns that might explain what he now could not reverse. He looked at the last conversation we had, the tone of my responses, the absence of emotional escalation, and began recognizing something he had previously dismissed as normal. It was not that I had suddenly changed, it was that he had not recognized the change while it was happening. In the apartment, he stood near the hallway where my belongings had once been, now fully gone, and for the first time he did not attempt to fill the silence with assumptions. He simply stood in it. Across the city, I returned to my room and placed my key card on the table. The space around me remained unchanged, neutral and waiting, but I was no longer in a state of waiting. My phone lit up once more with a final message from Jason, short and uncertain, asking where things had gone wrong. I read it once without responding immediately. Not because I was considering how to answer, but because I understood that the question itself belonged to a timeline I was no longer part of. I set the phone down again and turned away from it. The distance between us was no longer something that could be negotiated through explanation. It had already become structure. And in that structure, there was no longer a shared center, only two separate paths moving in directions that could no longer intersect. The following morning arrived in the new city with a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm that no longer required emotional adjustment from me. I woke up before sunrise, not because of stress or anticipation, but because my body had already begun adapting to a structure that felt different from the life I had left behind. The room was still dim, the air still, and for a brief moment I simply lay there listening to the absence of anything demanding my attention. There were no messages waiting to be interpreted in emotional layers, no shared routines to prepare for, no unspoken tension in the space beside me, only silence that belonged entirely to me. I eventually got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the early movement of the city below. People were already in motion, cars moving through intersections, early workers stepping into buildings, lives unfolding in parallel without interruption. My phone, resting on the table, it had a few new notifications, But I did not reach for it immediately. I already understood the pattern they would follow. Jason had continued trying to reach me through messages that were becoming less structured and more uncertain in tone. There was no anger in them anymore, only questions that had arrived too late to shape the outcome. I read them one by one after a pause, noticing how each message now carried the same underlying shift: confusion replacing assumption, distance replacing certainty. He was no longer speaking from the position of someone who believed he understood the situation. He was speaking from the realization that he did not. Back in Chicago, Jason had spent most of the night in a state of fragmented focus. He had moved between rooms several times without purpose, not searching for anything specific, but unable to remain still in one place for too long. The apartment no longer felt like a shared environment. It felt like an unfinished sentence. Every object that remained carried an absence around it, and that absence was becoming louder than the objects themselves. He sat at the kitchen table in the early morning hours, my onboarding email still open on his laptop, rereading the same lines repeatedly. Not because the content changed, but because his interpretation of it was collapsing and rebuilding each time he looked at it. He had begun to understand that what he initially framed as a temporary shift had already become a completed transition. I was not stepping away from something unstable. I was stepping into something already established. That realization did not arrive dramatically. It arrived in fragments, through repeated confirmation that nothing he assumed would reverse the situation was actually reversible. In the new city, I attended my first formal day of onboarding. The environment was structured, efficient, and impersonal in a way that allowed clarity without emotional interference. Meetings were short, introductions precise, expectations clearly defined. I was not required to explain my past beyond what was necessary for context, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I needed to translate myself for someone else's understanding. Everything was oriented toward forward movement, not justification. During a brief break, I stood near a large window overlooking the city from a higher floor, holding a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold. I noticed how easily the mind adjusts when it is no longer negotiating its place inside a relationship that demands constant interpretation. Jason, meanwhile, had started reaching out again, but differently now. The tone of his messages had changed from expectation to uncertainty. He asked where I was, not in a demanding way, but in a way that suggested he no longer trusted his own assumptions about proximity or control. He tried calling once more during the afternoon, and I let it ring without answering. Not out of avoidance, but because answering would have implied that the version of communication he was still operating under was valid. It was not. Later that day, he visited the office where I had previously worked, hoping to confirm timelines or details that might provide clarity. What he found instead only reinforced the reality he was beginning to accept unwillingly. My departure was not abrupt. It was prepared, structured, and officially recognized. Every step I had taken was already documented in systems he had no control over. That lack of ambiguity removed the final space where denial could exist. In the evening, I returned to my temporary residence and reviewed the schedule for the following week. Meetings, assignments, and relocation steps were all clearly outlined. There was no emotional weight attached to any of it, only progression. Jason, on the other hand, was now sitting in a silence that no longer felt passive. It felt declarative. He replayed earlier conversations in his mind, not to assign blame, but to locate the moment where his understanding had diverged from reality. But that moment was not singular. It had been gradual, distributed across time, hidden in plain sight, within every assumption he never questioned. As night settled over both cities, I placed my phone on the table and stood by the window again. The skyline here did not carry memory, only presence. And in that presence, I understood something that no conversation could have made clearer. The life I had left behind was not breaking. It was simply continuing without me in it, just as I was continuing without it. And in that separation, there was no longer confusion, only completion. The morning began in a way that felt structurally similar to the days before, yet internally everything had already shifted into a more defined finality. I woke up in the temporary residence with the same quiet light filtering through the window, the same neutral stillness in the air, but my awareness of it had changed. Nothing here demanded emotional interpretation anymore. Everything simply existed as part of a system that was already in motion. I checked my phone after a short pause, expecting the same pattern of messages from Jason, and I was correct. There were more missed calls, a few longer messages now, and one voicemail that I had not yet listened to. I did not open it immediately. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I no longer experienced urgency in the way I used to. Instead, I prepared for the day ahead, reviewing onboarding documents and meeting schedules with a calm focus that did not require emotional balancing. Jason, on the other hand, had reached a point where silence was no longer something he could interpret as temporary distance. It had become structural evidence. That morning, he stood in our apartment holding his phone for a long time without unlocking it, as if hesitation alone could change what had already been confirmed. He had not slept properly. The space around him felt unfamiliar now, not because it had physically changed, but because his perception of it had collapsed. Every object in the apartment seemed to confirm absence rather than presence. My side of the closet remained empty. The counter space I used in the mornings stayed untouched. Even the sound of the apartment itself felt different, as if it no longer contained shared routine. He finally opened the onboarding email again, the same one he had read countless times before, but this time something in him did not resist its meaning. He scrolled more slowly, focusing on details he had previously skipped over, and for the first time he noticed how final the language truly was. Not suggestive, not conditional, confirmed, structured, executed. He sat down at the table and placed the phone beside the laptop, staring at both screens as if they were no longer tools of communication, but records of a decision already completed outside of his participation. In the new city, I attended another scheduled session, this time with a smaller group, focused on integration into upcoming projects. The discussions were practical, centered on expectations, timelines, and responsibilities. There was no space for ambiguity in any of it, and I found myself adapting to that clarity more easily than I expected. At one point, during a brief pause between discussions, I noticed a message notification appear again from Jason, but I did not open it. Not because I no longer cared, but because responding would have implied that the version of connection he was still operating under was still valid. It was not. Back in Chicago, Jason made a decision that marked the first active step out of confusion and into confrontation with reality. He left the apartment and drove to the office building where I had previously worked, hoping to find clarification from someone who might still provide him with context. The receptionist confirmed what he already feared, but had not fully accepted. I was no longer employed there, and my transition to another company had already been completed through official channels. When he asked for details, he was directed to human resources, contact information, but even that path only reinforced what he was beginning to understand. My departure was not informal, it was not emotional, it was procedural, and procedures do not reverse themselves based on personal realization. Meanwhile, I was in a scheduled orientation meeting when my phone vibrated again, but I left it face down on the table. The discussion in the room continued uninterrupted, focused on upcoming responsibilities and structural alignment within the organization. I realized then how different communication feels when it is no longer tied to emotional negotiation. Everything becomes clearer when it is no longer interpreted through personal attachment. Jason returned to the apartment later that day, and this time he did not immediately reach for assumptions. He sat down in silence for a long period, not attempting to call again, not attempting to reinterpret messages in ways that softened their meaning. Instead, he opened the voicemail he had left earlier and listened to it fully. His own voice sounded different to him now, less certain, more fragmented, as if each sentence was trying to maintain control over something that was already gone. In the evening, I returned to the temporary residence and reviewed the next phase of onboarding. My schedule was becoming more defined, responsibilities increasing gradually but consistently. There was no uncertainty left in my trajectory. Jason, at the same time, attempted one final step that he had avoided until now. He reached out directly to the consulting firm. Not through emotional messages, but through formal inquiry, trying to establish contact with someone who could explain the transition. The response he received was brief, professional, and unambiguous. My position had been accepted. My start date was confirmed. My relocation was already in progress. There was nothing to dispute, nothing to renegotiate. When he read that message, he did not react immediately. He simply held the phone in his hand, staring at it longer than before, as if still searching for a different interpretation that no longer existed. In the new city, I stood by the window later that night, watching the lights below form steady patterns of movement. My phone remained on the table, notifications still present but no longer disruptive. I finally listened to Jason's voicemail. His voice was quieter than before, not demanding, not accusatory, but unsettled in a way that revealed the collapse of certainty he had relied on. He asked questions, but none of them carried answers within them anymore. After it ended, I placed the phone back down and did not respond. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because there was nothing left that required explanation. Jason and I were now operating in two completely separate structures of time. One built on realization after delay, the other built on movement already completed. And in that separation, there was no longer tension, only confirmation that what had ended did not require permission to be final. I did not feel like my life had suddenly become different on the day everything ended. It felt quieter than that, like something inside me had simply stopped asking for permission to stay where it was never valued. Weeks had passed since I arrived in the new city, and my life had slowly begun to settle into something I did not recognize at first, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was finally mine without negotiation. My mornings no longer carried hesitation. My work had structure, clarity, and expectation that did not depend on being diminished to feel valid. There were still moments when silence reminded me of what I left behind, but it no longer pulled me backward. It only reminded me of distance. Jason never stopped reaching out immediately, after everything became clear. There were messages I never opened, calls I did not answer, and emails that grew more spaced out over time. At first, his words carried confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to acceptance that arrived too late to change anything. I never responded because there was nothing left in that direction that required my participation. Not anger, not revenge, just completion. One afternoon, I stood in a small cafe near my office, watching people move through their lives without interruption. I thought about how often we confuse being needed with being valued, how easily we stay in places where our absence is only noticed after it becomes permanent. Jason had not been cruel in a loud way. His mistake was quieter. He had spoken to me as if my worth was conditional, as if losing a job meant losing identity. But life had shown me something different. Losing a position does not define your value. Losing yourself while trying to preserve someone else's comfort does. I learned that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the first form of self-respect that finally arrives after years of misunderstanding. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been made to feel smaller in a place where you once gave your whole heart, I want you to understand something gently, without pressure. You are not defined by how someone reacts when you are struggling. You are not the labels placed on you in your lowest moments, and you are not required to stay where your presence is only appreciated when it is convenient for others. There were nights when I questioned myself, not because I was wrong, but because I had been conditioned to believe that leaving meant failure. But what I found on the other side was not loss. It was clarity. It was space to breathe without apology. It was the quiet understanding that sometimes the universe does not remove you from something to punish you, but to protect the version of you that you have not yet become. I do not say this as someone who has forgotten what happened. I say it as someone who finally understands it. There is a kind of peace that does not arrive loudly. It comes slowly, in small decisions that honor your own voice again, in choosing not to respond, in choosing not to return, in choosing yourself without needing permission from the past. And if you are still in that place where everything feels uncertain, I want you to know that clarity does come. Not all at once, but enough to guide you forward. Trust that small voice inside you that tells you when something no longer feels aligned. It is not weakness. It is awareness. I think about Jason sometimes, not with anger, but with distance. I hope he eventually understands not only what happened, but why it had to happen the way it did. Some lessons are not about blame. They are about timing. About learning too late that respect is not something you negotiate after it is gone. If this story reached you in any way, I hope you will take a moment to breathe and remember that your value was never something someone else had the authority to reduce. If you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts, or simply leave a small sign that you were here. Sometimes connection begins in the quietest ways, and if no one has told you today, you are not alone in what you are feeling. You are simply in a chapter that is still unfolding. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave you with is this: never allow temporary judgment to define permanent worth.